Well, thank you, HUD. Thank you, Erica. That was really quite an interesting, inspiring presentation. Difficult act to follow. But as HUD noted in his opening remarks, we really are very fortunate to have a truly remarkable group of panelists here to work with us today. They represent a broad range of communication across the whole communication landscape. So to kick off this conversation, what I'd like to do is to ask each panelist for his or her perspective regarding how the way that science is communicated affects the biomedical enterprise, both positively and negatively. And to start this off, I'd like to ask Angela to give us her perspective.
So it's a really broad question, and the place that I would like to start is in thinking about how we train scientists to communicate, actually, because we communicate in a wide variety of ways, right? We do it both through academic papers, we do it informally, at poster sessions, at conferences, within the scientific community, but we also talk to our family and friends about science, which is a huge source of informal outreach. Lots of scientists actually do participate in more formalized forms of outreach. So it's really an incredibly broad landscape, and I think the thing that unifies them in my mind is that teaching strong communication skills, the process by which you communicate clearly is actually quite similar regardless of the mode in which you're doing it. And so I instigated a required science communication course for the systems biology graduate students at Harvard Medical School. Our graduate program is quite small. It's about 12 students a year. And so it's in the fall semester, so it's the first thing that they do together as a cohort. And part of the reason why we did it was because we're a highly interdisciplinary program. And so the students needed to be able to communicate clearly to one another as well as to the wider scientific community. And we teach graphics, writing, and oral presentations as part of the course. And the thing that I wanted to emphasize, especially after hearing Erica's talk, which was so inspiring, is that teaching communication is a real opportunity to work on some of these like deeper cultural issues that we have in science. And that's because to teach communication properly, the first thing that students need to grasp is that it's about relating to another person and developing the skills to really sit in somebody else's shoes and come up with a message that's not a simplified, sort of dumbed down version of what you want to say. It's about zooming out to a point of connection with another person so that you can relate to one another, right? And so I think that skill, learning that skill requires doing a lot of things in the course, right? And requires thinking about your audience. It requires developing a culture in the class of robust feedback, right? That's critical, but also positive, so that there's a real method to how you create sort of transparency in the class. And also teaching that everything is a process, right? So that there's no one answer on how to create a sort of good piece of science communication, but that you need to engage your community constantly in refining your message and how you're delivering it. So I would say that thinking about training scientists to communicate clearly gives us the opportunity to work on, I think, 3 really major cultural challenges that we face. The first one is thinking about biomedical careers and career paths, because clear communication skills are one of the deepest transferable skills that we can be teaching scientists. The second is thinking about our problem with racial and ethnic diversity and gender diversity in science, because by teaching people the sort of value of thinking about things from other people's perspective, you can make community groups that function well and can include more viewpoints and that people participate in more regularly. And then the last piece is that I think by accepting that science itself is a process and that communication is really the act of clarifying your thinking and your ideas, that you can really create a more humane workplace and culture that can tolerate mistakes and handle them clearly and with lines of responsibility, such that we can start to address some of these issues of sort of trust and transparency and rigor, even with inside of science. And so I would encourage us, when we think about communication in the biomedical enterprise, we think not just about the modes that we do it, but also sort of the social structures of training and the ways in which we teach people to communicate and the value of that part.
Thank you very much, Angela. Could we ask Regina to give us her perspectives? Thank you.
So I'm going to speak a little bit from my perspective as a statistician writing about statistics for scientists and for a general audience. And when I talk about statistics, I don't mean, the mean and the standard deviation, but this very important idea of uncertainty. So not just personal risk and the sort of thing that you talk to your doctor about, but when a scientist says, okay, here's the effect, the part that they often don't talk about is what's the uncertainty that goes along with that? How confident are we in that? And from my experience, sometimes it's because scientists don't necessarily understand that well themselves, and because I think statisticians have kind of failed to really communicate that well to scientists, so the blame doesn't go for scientists. So when we're talking about communicating scientific results, if we do a good job of communicating uncertainty, then it helps all the people, either the specialists, other scientists in other fields, stakeholders, public policymakers, to understand uncertainty, the inherent uncertainty, and that speaks to the process that you were talking about. And this important idea of how scientific facts become scientific knowledge and truth. And I think people are not always aware of the distinction of the two. So we do a good job. We really convey that in a way that people can handle this gray area of uncertainty and holding contradictory ideas in their head or grappling with that. And we do a bad job, then we get this sort of whiplash of, oh, well, today coffee is good for you, and last week I saw that coffee wasn't good for you. And the result is that people just give up and say, well, scientists don't know what they're talking about, because they're not seeing that meandering path of progress. So I think that goes from all the concentric expanding circles of scientists communicating with other scientists within their field, which maybe have a good idea of the uncertainty that's going on, but then scientists not in their field maybe have a little less of an idea, all the way out to kids who don't have any idea at all, and all the uncertainty that goes in with that. So I think it can backfire or support the idea of scientific progress. Thanks.
Thank you. To get a little bit of a corporate perspective on this, Fenton, could you share with us your...
The shareholders in SomaLogic just shuddered as soon as so I want to do something very corporate and talk about money in this whole thing. So if there is something truly innovative and interesting and a new field opens up, money tends to follow it, whether private or public, and also other people follow it. And what this does ultimately is have kind of a deadening effect on innovation, because you build up these giant things that can't be challenged easily. And I want to give two examples. One is near and dear to me. If you think about like the early 30s, mid 30s, 1930s, not that I was around, but I've been told by people like HUD, that they were convinced that proteins were the hereditary element, because DNA was just too boring and structural and stuff. And then we had the Avery McLeod-McCarthy experiments that showed, oh my gosh, DNA is doing something. And the race was on to look at DNA as a structure, which of course Watson and Crick won thanks to Rosalind and et al. And then all this money went into, wow, DNA is going to be the answer. And we've built this huge genomics thing that is unchallengeable in a way. And now the chickens are coming home to roost, and things aren't working out as well as we thought they might. And this is the latest thing in omnigenomics is the latest thing to try to make sense of this in a way for people. But what people are seeing is it's failing, and somehow we've ignored a bunch of other stuff You know, we've ignored proteins, we've ignored metabolites. This is starting to happen, but the money's not there, and it's too much of a challenge to the system. And so I don't know where the responsibility lies for that, but the hype along each step of the way, and having been part of the Broad Institute and running their communications, I'm just as guilty as anyone, has somehow got us to a point where we can't think our way out of it. And I think that's a negative effect of effective science communication. The other is purely cultural, and this is a kind of an off-color story. Don't worry, it's not going to be like ruining FASEB's reputation or anything. But in the early days of Nature Medicine, one of the things we decided to do in the news section was to focus on HIV/AIDS, because that was the hot story back in all the stuff happening. And a couple of the AIDS conferences got to work with a lot of the treatment action group folks. One in particular, Spencer Cox, who had a particular take on life. And it was this huge AIDS meeting, and it was the big one where everybody was disappointed. And he said, we've been calling this huge group of people that have all of a sudden glommed onto us the National Association of People Living Off of AIDS. It's kind of a horrifying thought at the moment when he said it, and I like, wow. You know, we're in some ways our own worst enemies. You know, we wanted all this attention, we wanted all this stuff, but it's also attracted a way to try to keep in the box, to keep the money there. So it's a very cynical way of looking at it, I know, but it is, especially in corporate world, we have to be so careful that with the shareholders and stuff that we not overhype something, because it could be deadly. So, yes, I'm sorry to be a downer, but that was initial thoughts.
Thanks, Finn. Bruce, would you be willing to share with us your thoughts?
Coming for a completely different perspective. I've spent 40 years or so worrying about science education at K-12 and higher levels, and as everybody probably knows, we're in the middle or beginning of a revolution of how we think about science education. And it's very relevant, I think, to this meeting. The Academy, when they prepared this document, Science and Creationism, which we do every 10 years for school boards and so on, commissioned a series of focus groups using these one-way mirrors, hiring companies that try to figure out how to sell soap, and so they got something like 20 college-educated adults behind the mirror, and they discussed what they thought of science. And that was done in several different locations across the country. And the striking take-home lesson for me is that these people, so many of them thought of science as what scientists believe. It's the dogma of scientists, and the religious view of creation is what your pastor, what your minister believes, and you can choose either one because they're both, belief systems. Of course, we know that science is not a belief system, but if you look at the way we teach science, it's taught as a belief system. We lecture. I was as guilty as anybody starting at Princeton. Here's what we know, and we don't. And Erica made this point. We don't realize that the more important thing to convey even to first-year biology students at college and lower levels is what is science? How does it work? And so there is a movement now to flip classrooms, to move away from exams that test for facts, to make class mostly about problem solving. We would like, we're just on the beginning of this, but we'd like students to come away from every first-year college course understanding what science is, how it works, why scientists disagree. Nevertheless, you should pay attention to the scientific consensus. We'd also, in the more ambitious, more recent goal, is to see if we could somehow, through science class, get people to begin to think more logically and look for evidence in their everyday life, not just in science class. And I was just at a workshop at the Carnegie Institution in New York. We were trying to start a little project, or maybe a big project, to do experiments about, can we make that happen? Can we really help students at many different ages think more logically and use evidence. And this might be done at different, at college, at high school, at middle school. When is the right time to start doing this, and how do we do it? So I would hope that this meeting could be ambitious by trying to create a series of possible strategies for experiments, because we're scientists, at least many of us. And I think we need to try to learn. I think the scientific societies could be a major force for spreading interesting experiments. I just want to end by talking about one that I think is directly related to some of the, like what Angela said. When I was at Science Magazine, I said, I can't understand half the abstracts in biology. They're all using so many three-letter words and abbreviations, and the scientists are writing things that they deeply understand. They don't know how to communicate even to another scientist what they're talking about. So we made a push to have them rewrite their abstracts so that somebody could understand who wasn't an expert. And, you know, I'm exaggerating, but I would say something like half of the scientists could not do it without the editors actually giving them huge, huge help to write an abstract that other people could understand who are scientists. So we failed really to teach in graduate school the kind of things that you're doing. So Dudley Hirschbach, a great Nobel Prize-winning chemist at Harvard, had an idea. He advertised this something like 20 years ago at Harvard that every PhD thesis can't be accepted until it contains two pages that written for a general audience. The way he said it, your grandmother has to be able to understand it, right? I think if we did that, it would help a lot to develop scientists as better scientists, because so many scientists get lost in this narrow path, and if they actually thought more broadly about what they're doing and through trying to communicate to a broader audience, they might change what they're doing and make it more important. If you realize you can't explain to your grandmother why this is worthwhile doing, maybe you'll do something different. So the last thing that I might say is maybe this could be incorporated not just at the thesis level, but in your thesis committee meeting, which occurs every year, supposedly. You know, you have to write a page that your grandmother could understand and sort of stand back, get some perspective on what you're doing. I don't think we have trained scientists very well.
Thank you, Bruce. I think Dudley would be very pleased to hear that you've picked this up, and I agree that scientists, certainly of my generation, have managed to screw things up pretty well. So, Lee, would you be willing to join in the fray here?
Sure. So I want to come back to the issue of training, but from a different perspective. I want to bring up the issue of ethics. We all train our grad students, in theory, in ethics, but really it's primarily focused on research practice, research ethics. But a lot of the issues of science communication have an underlying ethical issue, I think. And we don't really address that in any of our training, but also I think in our scientific communities in general. Science is hard, and those of you who are practicing scientists or who were practicing scientists know this. It's really tedious. I think it's when Erica was talking about how you have to find this authentic story. If you're a graduate student working in the lab, that's really challenging to do sometimes because you feel like you're hitting your head against the wall most of the time. And I think that there's a lot of pressure all through the professional career of scientists to produce exciting results and to promote those exciting results. our grants ask for, statements of impact and innovation. Our papers, you want to submit a paper to Science, you better have a paper that is really exciting. And even if you want to submit a paper to a much less prestigious journal, if you don't have a really exciting story, you're not going to get that published in that journal. And so there's a lot of pressure on graduate students, there's a lot of pressure on postdocs, there's a lot of pressure on faculty. All of the things that we're evaluated on have to do with how well we can promote our science. And part of that is a communication issue, but part of it is also an ethical issue. And I think we need to acknowledge the fact that the pressure is there to hype at every level. So, and it's not just within the scientific enterprise itself, it's within our universities. Our universities want us to promote our science because that's how our universities gain their reputation. The reputation is built on the excitement that accrues to our products. So I think that this is a big issue, and we haven't done a very good job of acknowledging it. And I think that has to be part of the conversation. We have to figure out a way to train our students, our scientists, that yes, you need to communicate what drives you, what is the important story, but you also need to be honest about how you're portraying that story, and you need to be honest about what your findings actually are, and you need to embrace the uncertainty, embrace the complexity of our field. Our fields are very complicated, and everyone, our field, our communities, the broader community, a disservice when we try to oversimplify and we try to make those stories sound bites. Our stories need to be about how we're trying to solve this incredibly complicated puzzle. I do a lot of work for the American Cancer Society, and I go to their fundraising events. They have these like Relays for Life and various activities, and I speak about how we've made a huge amount of progress on understanding how cancer works, but it's every person's cancer is different because everyone has an individually different genetic makeup, and how and I try to make everybody in that area understand that the complexity is almost unbelievable, and that doesn't mean we can't make progress. It just means that we can't expect simple solutions. So I think that we have to really think about creative ways to address the systemic incentives to over-promote your research and to oversimplify your research.
Thanks, Lee. Ivan, would you be willing to finish this off?
Sure. It's actually always reassuring to think that I'm going to be cynical, but then end up less cynical than the corporate guy. Although we'll see by the end of my mini rant whether I'm actually less cynical. I think that what I would do is pick up a bit on what we heard from Fintan and from Lee, and actually turn the question around. So we're sort of being asked to look at how does science communication affect the biomedical research landscape? I would ask everyone in this room to think about how the biomedical research landscape and biomedical research as an enterprise, dare I use the word industry, although I'm sure I'll get asked to leave the NIH grounds for saying that, how that actually affects science communication. Certainly the work that I do, the work that I think that I would say Erica and her students do, and many of the rest of us around the room. And about 2 years ago now, the AMA Medical Ethics Journal, they have an online-only publication, made a decision that they probably regretted soon after they made it, which was to ask me to write my sort of, nuts and bolts of how my almost, if you will, grand unifying theory of why science journalism is so bad, why much of it is in such bad shape. I, of course, exempt all of Erica's students and those who were students of, Rob's and what have you, and any of my students, of course. But be that as it may, most people don't go to our programs. And what I sort of, what had been boiling in my head for a while was this idea that from soup to nuts, the entire enterprise not just encourages, it's almost demands hype. So from the very minute that a scientist decides, and I think, again, we heard this, I think a bit more from Lee maybe than Fintan, but from the very minute a scientist decides what he or she is going to focus on, that is a decision based on, and we can all sort of, I guess pretend that it isn't based on whether or not the grant will get funded, but I'd like to meet that scientist and take him or her out to dinner maybe and understand their brain a little bit. It depends. They make decisions based on what will be funded. The journals make decisions based on what will get the most attention, whether it's actually press attention or citations. And then the journals do this thing, which some of you who may have had the misfortune of following my work for any period of time know is one of my obsessions, which is that, and I'm going to overstate the case a little bit, but only a little bit. Journals essentially tell scientists, without actually telling them this, don't talk to any of those pesky reporters until your paper appears, because if you do, we won't publish your paper. Now, can you find that on any website of any journal that you look at? Probably not, but it's this thing called the Inglefinger rule, and you can look up citations on that. And so why are we surprised then that what ends up happening is we only hear about single studies? And I'm delighted to hear that on IGMS from our director that single studies are being de-emphasized, if I understood you correctly, and the sort of narrative arc of science is being emphasized in your communications material. I think that's terrific, and I hope that is a sort of beacon of light for other organizations. But until we break this, and really where it starts is with incentives, because you have to get a paper into those, again, as we've heard from my colleagues here, you have to get a paper into those, what are, better for worse, called glamour journals. And you know what it's going to take to do that. So why anyone is surprised and why anyone would, and you can blame journalists, we're just as bad as the rest, we have to get clicks and all the rest of it, we're just as guilty. But why you would sort of turn around and sort of say, whoa, what's happening here, always reminds me of that scene from Casablanca, which I'm sure many of you remember. I know you don't because you weren't alive in 1943, Fenton. But those of us who had the fortune of watching later, the famous scene where this is where all the usual suspects, round up all the usual suspects comes from. They raid Rick's, they raid the club, and the head of police says, "I'm shocked to hear there's gambling going on here." And then someone comes up and says, "You're winning, sir," right? So this is what we live with. Lots of different fields live with that. But I would ask really that if we're really going to look at this issue seriously, which I know everyone around this table is interested in doing and is committed to doing, that we actually have to take many, many, many steps back from where the actual communication that we think of as communication is happening and think very clearly about what the incentive structure looks like. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that I have the answer. If I did, I would be probably on a different panel somewhere else. But, we need to think about those incentives. And I think there are some really interesting ideas that are happening in that area that maybe we can talk about more throughout the day. But what we've had with science communication and what we've been left with and what we've ended up with, to me, is an entirely and sadly and cynically maybe predictable outcome of the system that we have.
Thanks, Ivan. Boy, some very interesting ideas on this lead-off question. If I could now pose another question to the panel. How do you think the way science is communicated affects the future research workforce in academia as well as other areas? And for this question, I'd like to start off with Bruce. Would you be willing to give us your best shot on that one?
Well, just to pick on what was said, Judith and I have been talking about the fact that she was one of the originators of a program I greatly admire called the New Innovator Award at the NIH. I was a reviewer for the first cycle and other cycles. The first cycle they had 4,500 applicants, and they gave 30 grants. And I reviewed 35, and I took my top 4, which I was supposed to present, were all spectacular, and none of them got funded. So to get to the incentives on scientists, I mean, I agree that one of the major problems we have now is that graduate students and postdocs, that is, the people trying to become new scientists, not only have to wait far too long to become new scientists, but you know, they just are not given the chance to express their own ideas until an age that's generally way too old. But even more depressingly, is that they seem to be forced. They think they're being forced into a box, that they must work on something that they've already done. They can't do anything new. They must work on things that are obviously can be related to human health. I mean, there's a big push on them to work on mouse or human cells. And most importantly, not to ever try to do anything new, because that's too risky and you're not going to get by the NIH study section. So the New Innovator Award is completely different. Now, the only problem is it's only 30 a year, so I would like it to be 500 a year. And not only I, but a lot of my other colleagues, because I think it's only for relatively young scientists, but to get people to think, the question to me is, how many such grants at the NIH would be enough to get my graduate students that I'm still teaching, or the postdocs around me, to really think differently about what they want to do in the future, so they could go after really important, interesting, fascinating questions like those ants, right? I mean, NIH is not going to fund those ants. At least everybody thinks they're not going to fund them. But as we know from past experiences, from these crazy, weird things in biology that are all around, that breakthroughs come, like CRISPR. I mean, would they ever fund the CRISPR early developments now? I mean, I don't know. So I do think we have a problem, and one way to really change the only real way to change the mindset of what biological science is to reward the kind of things that we really want, which is creativity, innovation, young people doing something different than what their mentors did. And as somebody who's been writing a textbook on cell biology since 1978, I'm certain there's so many things that are fascinating that we don't understand, that nobody's working on with modern methods. I mean, and we know why, because of the system of constraints that young people feel. So the enemy really is us. I mean, the reviewers, the scientists who sit on committees and so on, including those who review papers. We have a major problem with peer review. It seems to be that peer reviewers all complain when they submit a paper that you can't publish a paper until everything's been done, and you do another 2 years of experiments, then you could publish a paper. But that's not the way science is supposed to work. But yet, when they themselves are reviewers, they're not thinking about that. They're not thinking about what they're doing to the other person. So that's another kind of training program we need. So I think we made we being people like myself, scientists, really have to do something here.
Thank you. Well, let's go down to the other end of the table and ask Fenton if he would take a look at this.
Sorry. So I just adore what Bruce said, but I'm also keep coming back to this notion of how the hell do you pay for this stuff, and the motives behind the funders are not necessarily aligned with the science communicators. So I think about things like, the Broad Institute was wildly successful early on because they put a huge amount of money into building an infrastructure of toys that encouraged Harvard and MIT to play nice together. That's in essence how the Broad Institute got going. They built this massive proteomic structure and sequencing structure and cell visualization structure and sample handling, and said, if you want to play, you have to play nice together. And it was effective. But that's, there aren't a lot of Eli Broads in the world throwing $600 million around. I think about big companies like Novartis when Mark Fishman founded the research of the NIBR thing there, and they went after rare diseases, much to the chagrin of Novartis, because he argued that they would learn a lot of great science and expand it out to other stuff. And it turned out to be true. And then everything that was kind of open for a while all of a sudden got embraced by the mothership Novartis, and now you don't hear anything about what goes on because it's a different set of values. I think there's a myth that somehow the academic scientists are the pure people in all of it, though, and that's why I liked what Bruce was saying, even though he didn't say it quite that way. We tend to limit science communications to stuff that the ground is already prepared to accept, and the stuff that's funded because it's been proven in the past successful. And so how we break out of this into something really innovative and this kind of crazy idea thing again is really at the heart of how we're going to get out of this.
Thanks, Vinton. If we could go to Regina now, would you?
One perspective on this is that science doesn't exist in a vacuum, that it's not just scientists who need to understand about science and have the proper perspective, but it's everyone around it supporting it, the business people, the teachers, the data scientists, the computer scientists. So when we're communicating science and we're talking about the future workforce and how that's being done, they can't exist with all these other people providing the money and the infrastructure and the support. And if we continue to give the idea that, okay, either you're a science person or you're not a science person, then we're going to end up increasingly, ghettoized and isolated, and people aren't going to want to even touch it or do it, or they're going to bring the wrong ideas to it. So I'd like us to think, when we're thinking about the science communication, it's all the other people in general, and that you don't need to be a science person to be able to get that way. And sometimes when we think about communicating science, we don't necessarily target the college students. We're talking about, okay, in a biology class, or the young graduate students, that are entering into a biology science program. But what about the others? Are they required to take science? Are we doing a good job? We kind of turn our nose up and say, oh, that's, bio for jocks or something like that, But why does it need to be, why does that public engagement need to be, scorned? Thanks.
Ivan, would you be willing to take a swing?
Yeah, it's to be honest, I'll leave it to others who've spoken already, who actually train graduate students and postdocs. I've never done that, and I would hope that no one ever entrusts me with that. In science, I've obviously taught graduate students in journalism. I just want to respond to something that Fintan said, and while I wholeheartedly agree that there is very much, and I think this gets back to something Bruce was saying about peer review, there is this sort of, does it ratify, does it just sort of agree more or less with what we've heard before? Maybe it moves things incrementally. I actually don't see that as much of a problem. I understand where the problems are with that, because in sort of my line of work, if you will, I see the opposite problem, and I think they both exist, so I'm not saying that what Fintan was pointing at doesn't, because I very much agree it does. But there's the opposite problem, which is that it is the sexy result. We just heard from Erica about Arsenic Life, which is a terrific example of it was too good to be true, if I'm sort of not overstating the case, and because it was too good to be true. And so we actually have, and they're happening at different places and different levels. So maybe you might say, and again, the sort of quote-unquote glamour journals. I think I heard someone at dinner, I won't out him or her from last night because it was a private conversation, but talking about CNS syndrome, right? So cell nature science sort of syndrome. Well, there maybe you have this sort of problem with the findings needing to be all that really, really too sexy, and maybe at other journals, and they're not, to me, in my mind, they're not really lower tiered. Maybe they're just sort of specialty and in many ways more robust, rigorous journals that are publishing some of the stuff that we think of as incremental. I think those are both happening at the same time. I think the question for me as an outsider is, what message does that give to graduate students and postdocs about what the best way forward is? And I guess I would be shocked if a grad student wasn't left with the idea that the best way forward for his or her career would be to do that sort of overly sexy thing, not to just sort of incrementally or try and replicate something somebody else had done. So again, but I say that as an outsider because I've worked in a lab many years ago, actually around the time that Dudley Hirschback was teaching me chemistry. Speaking of which, but I don't profess to know all of that world that well.
Lee?
So your original question was about development of the scientific workforce. And when I think about that, I think about the progression from K-12 through college through grad school. And I see that there's a real sort of disconnect between those different segments of education. Kids tend to be really excited about science. They like science. Science is cool. And then they get to college and they're slammed with big, heavy textbooks that get heavier every year. My colleague with his eponymous cell biology textbook has gotten very large. The field has gotten very large. I speak for my field. We know a whole lot more than we knew 20 years ago. And we know a lot more than we knew 50 years ago. We even know more than we knew 10 years ago. And to get to the point where you can be a freely acting scientist, where you can pursue your own ideas, you're expected to master the body of knowledge that already exists. And that body of knowledge has gotten really large. And so when we train our undergraduates, all of a sudden they're inundated with these big textbooks, and they are told, okay, you have to master this before you can become creative. And I think that's a real challenge. A, it's a real challenge for students, but B, it's actually a challenge for their transition to graduate school, because they understand a pedagogical method when they're a college student. They understand that they have to master this body of knowledge. And then when they get to graduate school, we expect them to all of a sudden realize that they can think for themselves and be creative and try to understand things with a different method. And we don't do a very good job of facilitating that transition. And I think there are a lot of pedagogical innovations that address that question, but we're not very universal about it. And so I speak both as a professor of undergraduate science students. I'm at a science and engineering school who their goal is to go to graduate school because that's what they know. And they have a particular perspective based on the education that they've had up to the point that we see them, and then while we have them. But I also speak as the director of our graduate program, where I see all of our incoming graduate students. And there is a very big transition between undergraduate and graduate school. And a lot of students can't make that transition because they expect graduate school to be like undergrad. And then a lot of students who are undergrads, they think that graduate school is going to be what they are familiar with and used to. And I think that science communication, to get back to the original question, can actually help us as educators to facilitate that transition by focusing on the stories. like how science is done, to address this for both undergraduates and graduate students.
Thank you, Lee. Angela?
So there have been so many threads that since I'm the last one here, that I want to see if maybe I can hop around to sort of build on a couple of them as we close out the question. So the first one was from Bruce, talking about like reviewing culture and both in the context of publication and grants and sort of how we think about these things. And so to return to this theme of the fact that teaching science communication, like effective science communication, can have sort of cascading impacts on other challenges that we face. I think this is one of the places where it can be really helpful specifically on that problem, because in order to teach a process for science communication, you have to teach people how to give constructive feedback. And part of giving constructive feedback is knowing who are you in service of, right? Who is eliciting your feedback and what is their goal, right? And in the context, and how can you help them to meet their goal, right? And so to take the example of reviewing a paper, there are two people that you are trying to help. The first one is the editor, to make a decision about how this paper fits into the arc of the field and whether or not you think its conclusions are valid, right? The second person you are trying to help is the author, to make sure that they've written the clearest, most accessible paper that they can, and that you're trying to prevent them from making any mistakes, public mistakes that they may wish to avoid, right? And when you think of those two audiences, it does not include yourself and aggrandizing yourself with all of your amazing ideas for experiments that these people might do, right? And so by being very clear about the process of giving feedback and who the stakeholders are in it, and how when you choose to give it, you're providing a service and you need to structure your information accordingly, and to think concretely about like what are the things about this piece that work, which are the things that don't, and how could they be improved, and which things need to be tossed altogether. The most important thing is understanding this other person, right? And are these other people? And I think that that can go a long way to understanding our role in the larger system when we're reviewing a grant or reviewing a paper, right? So that was one thread. And then I have other threads. Let me look at my other threads here. Okay, the second thread was thinking about what Regina had said about science doesn't exist in a vacuum, and this tendency that we have to delineate between who is a science person and not a science person, right? Which is to all of our detriment in a bazillion different ways. The two that stand out most in my mind are how it makes us less willing and able and respectful of interacting with professionals in other spaces, and really is the detriment of those relationships. And then the fact that we have a perception that once you decide to not be working at the bench as a research scientist, you are not a scientist anymore. And so those are two flip sides, I think, of a cultural issue that is important for thinking about the biomedical research enterprise overall. And again, this sort of larger landscape of I would love there to be more scientists doing more kinds of jobs out in the world. I would love to see more scientists in the legislature. I would like to see more scientists actively engaged in policy. I would love to see more scientists trained with PhDs who go into K-12 education. I think we can bring a really valuable perspective to lots and lots of different careers. Teaching science communication can be one of the first steps in doing that by requiring scientists to engage with other professionals to do it well, and to realize that these people bring incredible skills to the practice of science and will make your science better. And so I think that partly taking on the challenge of training scientists to do it, again, might have cascading effects. The last one is more of a sort of aspirational idea, maybe, to think about the sort of landscape of what kinds of communication we produce and how we think we use it. And this is in response to Lee's point about the fact that there is an enormous amount of information for scientists to grapple with as they continually, right? It's not that suddenly you become a graduate student and you have to do it. Like, I'm doing it all the time. There are new pieces of research that I go to read, and actually, like Bruce, reading the primary literature on it is sometimes mind-numbing, right? And so when we think about making these pieces of science communication that are ostensibly for the public, they may also be for us, right? If we really take seriously the fact that in the long run, the amount of information is not going to decrease, right? It is only going to increase, and that it is not ever again going to be possible for us to feel like we have the entire canon of knowledge before we begin to go work on a problem. Such that public engagement might actually just be communication at different scales of resolution that all of us use when we go to engage with a new field. Like, I love the stuff on astronomy and physics, which is not necessarily my area. And that may also incentivize us to do it in a different way and also to value it differently, right? That actually everyone is a scientist at a different scale of resolution. You know, my kids who are in elementary school are scientists in a very concrete way, which is that they're doing experiments, social and in the world, all the time, right? And so I think that there might be a way where we recast even what we're talking about from us communicating to some people who are not us to the way that we communicate altogether.
Wow, thanks. Nice job in tying some ends together. I have another question, but we only have 5 minutes. So what I would like to do is if we could start with Fenton at the end and come all the way down here, just a very brief closing statement of what the question I had, which we've really touched on it to a certain extent, is how does the way we communicate science affect financial support for what we do from all sources? You don't have to address that question, but if you'd like to because we really have in many respects, but your closing thoughts.
I think it's just so critical to claim what science is at its very heart, and that is kind of wonder at the world, uncertainty about making any real conclusions about anything. Ultimately, everything is tentative, and loving to live in that kind of world and sharing that kind of infectious joy with people is the real challenge of science communication, not giving answers. So.
Yeah, Tom, I'll answer your question in the next panel, so I'm going to leave the time for that. I guess I would say, and I think this picks up on some of the great summations that Angela was just making. I think it's really important for all of us who are in this ecosystem, I'm in a particular aspect of it, each of us is, to understand that it's an ecosystem, and that it is, I think that the days, as Angela and others have said, the days of one-way communication or even two-way communication are gone. I'm not sure they were ever actually there, but they're certainly gone now, and it's beyond even a conversation. I'm not even sure what it is. Metaphors are not my strength, as my students well know, but there's some sort of cacophony, I think, that would work here. And I think that understanding where we all are at that, what our incentives are, what our needs and goals are, and not thinking of it as just from high on the mountain is probably a good place to start.
I really like the idea of we're all scientists at different levels of resolution, and I'm completely going to steal that, credit you. I think that's wonderful. It's kind of blowing my mind in a lot of ways, and I think it really gets us back to this idea of thinking about children and the wonder, all the way up to science communication can be education as well, and we don't need to just think of it as publicity or selling something, informing each other. And I think realizing at our heart that although we might feel like we need to be very important and make it about us, and we need to be smart because we have PhDs and we've done all of this, to realize that sometimes we really like to see fun videos like, Erica showed us, or comics Head and I were talking about, and really kind of open up to a little bit more of a playful idea of science communication that's not necessarily degrading the biomedical research landscape, to have a little more fun with it.
So I'm going to pick up on the point that Ivan made about the complex ecosystem. And I would like to advocate for not advocating simple solutions. That I don't think there are simple solutions to this complicated question. And I think that the best that we can hope to come up with are some guiding principles. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, to try to work towards a set of guiding principles rather than solutions that will necessarily be oversimplified.
I'll just build right on that, which is that I think when innovating in this space, we should think about how to teach process, right? That depending on your goal or your audience, there is a different piece of science communication that might be ideal, and there will be multiple such solutions, right? And so the best that we can do is teach people a robust process by which they can set their goals in a meaningful way, a meaningful and specific way, envision their audience well, right? Iterate through a process that includes other people, because in communicating, like, you have to have other people weigh in on how well it is going. And in the process, teach how to incorporate that input from other people in a meaningful way, to structure what you need from them and to take it in. We often perceive science as an incredibly critical culture, right? Sometimes we won't admit that we don't understand something because we think that there's some shame, and maybe it's our own fault that we're like not smart enough or didn't realize what the acronym meant, and that means we're not expert in the thing. We need to get rid of that and understand that, like, if I, as another scientist, and somebody who wants to read your paper cannot understand it, like, that's a problem. That's a challenge that needs to be solved, right? So learning to accept other people's feedback as meaningful, right, and what to do with it is really important. And then the last piece, I think, is understanding that involves a certain number of emotional challenges for people to do well, right? And that there are techniques and skills for handling that stuff too, right? So if we think about how much of our communication is in objects like, written documents and videos and things like that, one way to think about the emotional challenges of communicating science clearly is that in some way it is all public speaking. And public speaking terrifies people, right? And so when you're creating a public document for consumption, right, it's a big move, right? And so we need to also accept that, like, part of the process is accepting what it means to, like, lay your claim, right? And not hide behind a lot of technical language. Like, go ahead and say what you gotta say. And people might fight with you. What's it like if you have somebody fight with you? What's it like to have to defend what you want to say? What's it like to, have to backtrack if it turns out you were wrong later, right? Like, that's what risk is, right? And so I guess my point would be that there are undoubtedly best practices in all of those different kinds of arenas that we should be thinking about as a sort of a holistic process that could be applied in a lot of different situations.
So Saul Perlmutter is a Nobel Prize-winning physicist at Berkeley who's always been interested in education. He used to teach physics and music to non-majors, but for the last 4 years he's been teaching a even more ambitious course I can't remember the title, but it's basically for non-majors, how to think scientifically. And it's really a research project. And I think it's fascinating. I'm going to paraphrase what he says about science, and I can't get it exactly right. Science is a remarkable system of procedures and values designed to prevent humans from fooling themselves. Now, if we could get the public to realize that somehow, that's not the way they think. They think we're doing something completely different. So that's one of the things I want. And the other thing I wanted to just get into the mix is that, why we're all excited about science is all the things we don't know. Every time you discover something, you realize how little you understood before. And so, my textbook, which is way too heavy, at least the last edition, we recognized that students were getting the impression that we know everything because that's what we write. So at the end of every chapter now, we have what we don't know. And that was the most fun part for the authors, voting on one of the most important things that we don't know, because I would say we understand about 10% about what we have to understand about cells to really say we understand them. And so I would like communication of science to include that too. That what's motivating scientists is not just to make a discovery, but there's always another puzzle, and maybe to lay out what we're trying to understand and don't understand as well as what we just learned.
Well, I would like to close this session out by thanking all the panelists in a very real and personal way. This has been a very interesting, deep conversation, and I really appreciate it. So we'll take a short break now. Do we come back at 11 o'clock?